The story of change and progress that took this rough dirt runway and turned it into one of the fastest growing airports in the country begins in the 1920s, when the Oakland airfield captured the imaginations of its East Bay neighbors.
At that time, there were 5 children, and my father had, or the family had, a 1927 or 1928 Studebaker sedan. And I do remember our all piling into it and going down to the airport. It was Sunday after church. We went down to see the planes take off and come in.
Those visits to the airport inspired Maggie G. to become a pilot herself. She joined the Women's Air Force in World War II.
Every time a plane came down, I think, people clapped. This person's been up in the air soaring with the birds and the clouds. The Oakland airport had not been there, and I had not seen planes fly. Who knows what I would have done during the war.
It was really the only airport around. San Francisco wasn't as big.
Leo Bruning was a teenager when he and his friends came to watch the airplanes.
On the weekends, it was pretty crowded out there because people would flock out there. And a lot of them wanted to go up for a ride, and these operators would take you up for a ride for $5, you know, fly you around for about a half hour and bring you back.
The airport at the time was little more than a runway, but it was the first in the Bay Area, and it's always had good weather, been easy to get to, and convenient for pilots and passengers alike.
Oakland had less wind, less fog, and fewer hills close at hand. It just took off, so it quickly became the major airfield of the West Coast at that time.
The federal government gave Oakland just the boost it needed, establishing a West Coast airmail center here in 1927.
The secret for dominance for airports at that time was to be the base of operations for an airline that had an airmail contract. Once they knew that they were the western terminus for the transcontinental air route, then they knew they had a guaranteed amount of business.
For Lindbergh, oh what a flying fool was he. Lindbergh, his name will live in history over the old.
And soon after Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic in 1927, the Army announced that 2 of its pilots, Lester Maitland and Albert Hegenberger, would attempt to fly to Hawaii in June of that year, and they'd take off from Oakland.
Pacific was more of a challenge, and in those years, 1927, it was doubtful if you could make it. So it was really precarious and bold and daring of anyone to even imagine they could fly to Hawaii.
The first thing they needed was a better runway.
27 days, working day and night around the clock with mule teams. The port commissioners had an airfield that was 7,000 some odd feet long, allowing the Army to make that takeoff.
The 2 Army pilots reached Hawaii in a plane called the Bird of Paradise in 25 hours and 50 minutes. 2 weeks later, 2 civilians, Emery Bronte and Ernest Smith, took off in their monoplane, the City of Oakland, and made it to Hawaii 14 minutes faster. The 2 flights were the first in a series of historic events in Oakland during the summer of 1927.
The amazing thing about Oakland Airport is that even before the first building was built, and they laid out this emergency, quickly built long runway, they had like 3 famous flights that made world history. It's just extraordinary that Oakland got off, as I say, to a flying start.
But the excitement around the Oakland airport was just beginning. In August of 1927, James Dole of the Hawaiian pineapple family celebrated the anniversary of the U.S. annexation of Hawaii by sponsoring a race to those islands.
There was a $25,000 reward for the first people who could fly from Oakland to Hawaii.
Les Thomason went with his father to watch the Dole race begin.
There was so many people out there. I remember this girl. She had this great smile, and she just was so excited about this trip, going to Hawaii.
That girl was a school teacher named Mildred Duran, a passenger on one of the 15 planes that entered the race. But it was chaos from the beginning. 3 planes crashed on their way to Oakland. Only 8 planes actually lined up for the race. 2 of them crashed on takeoff. 1 was disqualified. 3 others were lost at sea, including the one carrying Mildred Duran.
I think there was only 2 planes that made it. And the girl, too, was lost.
That has gone down in history as one of the great air race disasters, but full of drama. It gives you pride and it gives you sadness about the crazy, heroic, wonderful and silly things and dangerous things that people do. It's just part of who we are.
But the fallout from the Dole race was not all bad.
The victories overwhelmed the defeats and just demonstrated the potential for air traffic worldwide over the great expanses of the ocean.
Oakland was suddenly the principal gateway to the Pacific. This is, after all, the airport described by Charles Lindbergh as the finest, most modern airport in the country. Shortly after he conquered the Atlantic, he came to Oakland for the official opening of the airport in September 1927.
You couldn't get close to them. There was so many people, and they just kept you at a distance. But you could see him, you know. There he was, you know, getting out of his airplane, and it was quite an eventful day for Oakland.
I was lucky enough to meet him at the Oakland airport. It was when he was one of his trips there and at the grand opening of the airport.
Jack Walker was just 5 years old when the airport opened, but already an aviation prodigy, a protege of the well-known flyboys at Oakland.
I was called the Air Ambassador of the Oakland Airport, and I used to greet a lot of the dignitaries that flew in. Charles Lindbergh gave me a model of the Spirit of St. Louis because I was the youngest pilot, I guess you'd call it, and the Air Ambassador of the Oakland Airport.
While he was here, which was just a period of hours during the day with the Spirit of St. Louis, we recognized and commented that Oakland had the potential to become the center of air commerce in the nation, really. And he really was correct.
You have Hagenberger and Maitland in June of 1927. You have Bronte and his partner going over in July. You have the Dole race in August. You have Lindbergh in September. I mean, that's like a grand slam, you know, and Oakland was just known at that point.
Lindbergh's visit put the fledgling airfield on the national aviation map. Blessed by geography and climate, Oakland was soon one of the most important airports in the country. Boeing, Pacific Air Transport, and soon United Airlines were flying mail, cargo, and passengers in and out of Oakland. A rotating beacon and well-lit runways meant pilots could land safely at night. And Oakland had the first airport hotel and restaurant in the country, right next to the terminal. By then, this was the airport of choice for many famous pilots, among them 2 Australians, Charles Kingsford Smith and Charles Ulm, along with 2 Americans, radio man James Warner and navigator Harry Lyon Jr. They made the first flight all the way across the Pacific to Australia, leaving from Oakland.
These were men with a vision. These were pioneers.
They did it in the open cockpit of their aircraft, the Southern Cross. The trip, with stops in Hawaii and Fiji, took over 83 hours. Today, it would take just 14.
My father was born in 1891. He was involved in the history with the first flight across the Pacific Ocean. So he was still alive when man landed on the moon.
Tom Warner's father was the radio man on the Southern Cross. By today's standards, he says, those conditions were primitive.
There's no insulation. There was floorboards, and that's it. You know, there's just floorboards. Well, they hung the radio gear on the sides of the aircraft with rubber bands, and they put a couple of chairs in there.
They knew it was risky, great challenge. I think that they were prepared to lose it all if they didn't achieve it. They were daring, dashing guys.
The mystique of the Oakland airport increased in 1931 when Amelia Earhart first arrived here in an unusual aircraft called an autogyro. And she chose to land here again at the end of the very first solo flight between Hawaii and the mainland in 1935.
On this flight, really no bad weather at all except a few little rain squalls. I saw the moon and stars most of the night. Of course, in both flights, I was very glad to see land.
She was dressed in men's clothes, you know. I mean, she had slacks on and a leather jacket, and her hair was tousled, and there wasn't many women flying in those days. So it was quite an experience to see her.
Amelia Earhart, who is just, to me, has as much mystique probably as any personality in 20th century history. That first solo flight from Hawaii to North America ended here at Oakland to great cheering crowds. Then, of course, in her famous and mysterious last flight that she never returned from, she left from Oakland.
She left Oakland in May of 1937 with her navigator, Fred Noonan.
They started out and they got as far as New Guinea, again, destination Howland Island, mid-Pacific, and never have been seen since.
Air travel was beginning to take hold in the 1930s. In 1936, Pan Am's China Clipper began carrying passengers across the Pacific to the Philippines. 4,000 passengers passed through Oakland in 1929. 10 years later, more than 70,000 people were using the airport as planes became bigger, faster, and more comfortable. But for most people, flying was still a novelty. Les Thomason had grown into a teenager with a penchant for photography. This is the camera he used to shoot the air races in Oakland in 1938.
It was a big event. They had bleachers up, and there was hundreds and hundreds of people there. And Oakland was it was the airport.
Oakland was indeed, in the late 1930s, the aviation capital of the West Coast. But those carefree days were coming to an end. The Bay Area was becoming a staging area for military planes, and by 1943, passenger flights had ceased. Army and Navy planes crowded the runways, and the Navy took over the airport.
You had Navy reservists here, you had Army reservists here, and so there was a connection with Oakland and the military going back to the late 1920s.
By the end of the war in 1945, Oakland was no longer the major commercial air center on the West Coast. That title now belonged to San Francisco. But the huge numbers of pilots returning from the war needed jobs, and many started flying for charter airlines out of Oakland.
3 great ones, the largest in the world in their time, developed here. And that was initially Transocean Airlines under Orvis Nelson, which became a huge operation headquartered here at Oakland, followed by World Airways under Ed Daly, which did the same thing. And then the third one, Transamerica Airlines. Those were huge operations, and all of which were innovators.
Oakland Airport was preferred by most pilots that flew in and out of either San Francisco or Oakland. They preferred Oakland because it wasn't as crowded, and the terrain around Oakland Airport was certainly more favorable for flying.
Bill Keating flew in and out of Oakland for nearly 40 years, first for Transocean, the largest airline of its kind, pioneering low-cost charters to Europe and Hawaii, training thousands of pilots and flight attendants. But Transocean's finances were always precarious.
We were always on the verge of bankruptcy, and sometimes the paychecks didn't come through on time.
And in 1960, Transocean went bankrupt. Its facilities were taken over by World Airways, and its daring and dynamic president, Edward Daly.
I admire Ed greatly because he was a very innovative guy, took a lot of risks. He grew his airline from scratch into a huge airline, a non-scheduled airline, as we mentioned, one of the three that had headquarters here at successive times at Oakland.
Daley made his name and headlines through innovation, offering soldiers cheap flights home for R&R from Vietnam and carrying refugees on a daring last flight out of Da Nang at the end of the war. CBS News reported that story.
A stampede of terrorized people tried to storm the plane. From the cockpit, the pilots reported by radio that the situation was out of control. The hordes tried to jam up the stairway as Daley himself tried to block the stairs.
The news was no less dramatic in 1975, when Daley made another unauthorized flight out of Tan Son Nhut, bringing dozens of Vietnamese orphans to Oakland.
A charter jet landed in Japan today with orphan Vietnamese infants en route to the United States. The babies are part of an airlift by World Airways President Edward Daley.
The feeling that we all had inside was just incredible.
Julie Antonelli was a World Airways stewardess who cared for the babies on the way to Oakland.
We had succeeded once again in bringing some kids home.
When we arrived in Oakland, it was dark at night. It was close to midnight, as I recall.
And Bill Keating was the pilot.
You know, it felt terribly for the condition of some of the babies that were in. And the idea of bringing them out of there and getting them away was certainly in all of our minds and all of our hearts.
By this time, the airport had spread far beyond its origins at North Field. In 1961, the Port of Oakland broke ground on a new passenger terminal south of the old one, with a 10,000-foot runway and a 10-story control tower. It would be called Metropolitan Oakland International Airport.
There isn't a better site in the country, and probably very few equal to it in the world. Metropolitan Oakland International Airport is an airport for the jet age.
It opened in September of 1962.
The South Field basically represents the transition from propeller-driven aircraft to jet air travel. Oakland wanted to have a jet airport. It wanted to have an international airport. And as soon as that airport was built, they began to get the newest generation of jetliners coming in.
As those jets began using Oakland, air traffic here took off. By the end of the 60s, 1 million passengers a year passed through here, much of that traffic on short flights run by PSA and Air Cal.
Oakland, in the jet age, has always excelled as a commuter airport. Short range jet transports carrying people up and down the Pacific coast or within California.
But there were simply too few flights out of Oakland to satisfy the demands of the Bay Area's travelers. That all changed in 1978.
In 1978, we won a stunning victory. The CAB ruled in our favor and granted unlimited access into the Oakland market.
Once again, they saw an opportunity and ran with it, and they did very well. By the 1980s, they needed a whole new terminal to handle specifically that kind of air travel for PSA, and now it's all Southwest Airlines.
That new terminal opened in 1985 with PSA and Air Cal as its primary tenants. By the late 1980s, those two airlines' West Coast service was phased out, so Oakland began courting other airlines, asking them to come to the newly spacious airport in this underserved market.
In 1989, Southwest did that, and the rest is history. They're all over the country. They are the most profitable airline, and they began the low-cost era at Oakland.
At the same time, Oakland's unmatched history with cargo airlines continues.
Today we have FedEx, UPS, and DHL, all major cargo operations here at Oakland. We have a long history of cargo operations here and expect great things from cargo in the future.
More and more passenger airlines came to Oakland too. One of the latest is JetBlue.
JetBlue brought low-cost transcontinental service here at Oakland. It's what our passengers wanted, and we really look forward to JetBlue and other carriers providing expanded service destinations in the future.
The airport's future looks just as bright as its past, when so many events came together to write the story of the Oakland airport, a story full of historic firsts.
You know, being the first of anything, achieving against great odds. We all like that. That's success for the human race. That, I believe, really did give Oakland the name as the most historic airfield in the world.
It's the story of an airport that takes advantage of its opportunities. In April of 2004, the Port of Oakland broke ground on an expanded Terminal 2. With 5 new gates, the plans call for more spacious ticketing, security, concessions, and baggage claim areas.
As we go forward, we have a tremendous opportunity before us in the years to come to make this airport everything we want it to be.
And once that new terminal is finished, the airport promises even more improvements.
What Oakland is doing is what Oakland has always done. It is aggressively going after its share of the market. It's trying to survive. It's trying to be a player. It's trying to be an airport where things are happening. And to do that in this day and age, you have to keep growing to be competitive.
As that modern airport develops, the original airport, Old North Field, is still used by commercial and private pilots. It stands in tribute to this airport's varied past.
Today it's a very special day for us. 75 years of history and progress and accomplishment here at the Oakland International Airport.
On the airport's 75th anniversary in 2002, Jack Walker, once the airport's young air ambassador, was here again as the Grand Marshal of the celebration.
It's a whole different airport from when it was in the old days. In 1927, the runway out here was just a dirt runway.
But not any longer. Today, nearly 15 million passengers go through Oakland each year on more than 200 flights a day, offered by a dozen airlines. Maggie G., who learned to love flying while watching the planes at Oakland, is today part of this mural at the Ontario Airport. Sharing space with the Wright brothers and Sally Ride and Amelia Earhart, Maggie G. still lives nearby.
Today, the Oakland Airport's very important, though, because it's I can leave this community to go elsewhere, and it's in my backyard.
And Les Thomason, who made movies of the air races at Oakland in the 30s, still lives here too.
See, another plane, another plane. I still, to this day, when I hear a plane, I look up and look in the sky and just think how wonderful it is.